Warhammer takes a lot of inspiration from other places, and depending how nice you are, inspiration really means ripping off. Dune, Michael Moorcock, Lord of the Rings, there's a lot that went into the specialty soup that is Warhammer. But slightly less commonly known is that Warhammer also loves to steal from itself. Warhammer has a bit of a history of backporting things back and forth between the settings it has, at least when it comes to their first setting of Warhammer Fantasy and Warhammer 40k. Things going back and forth between AOS and 40k is rather more uncommon, though I may just not be looking hard enough. As for those first two though, Games Workshop has of course made things pretty similar between the two settings. Not identical, because one of these settings is a fantasy one, and one of them is science fantasy, so they have to make some lip service to space travel and whatnot, but you can find plenty of similarities. So for fun, how about we look at some of the comparisons that exist. From mankind to Elves and Eldar to the greenest of boys, be they Orcs with a C or a K, let's take a look at how the factions of Warhammer Fantasy are similar to their 40k counterparts and how they're different. Some of them aren't all that different, some of them are vastly different but still share the same basic identity, and some of them have basically no equivalent between the two settings. Either way, it'll hopefully be fun, and maybe you'll learn something. Or maybe not, because I am stupid. But before I begin, tell me, is it almost bedtime for you? In that case, allow me to introduce you to Manta Sleep, the sponsor of this video. Manta Sleep makes the finest of sleeping masks on this planet, with something for anyone who wants one. You've got the Pro Sleep Mask for all-around quality, two different versions of the Sound Mask if you want to listen to something as you sleep, the Silk Mask for unrivaled softness and comfort. There's something for everyone, I promise ya. I'm personally a fan of the weighted mask. It's a nice bit of pressure on my face while I go to sleep, and it's just as comfortable as any other option they have. I may sleep at hours best described as unusual, but you'd better believe with this thing I'm resting well. And if you too would like to get in on this amazing sleep aid, look no further. Use the link in the description and pinned comment as well as code Pancreas to get yourself a discount on your Manta Sleep order. That's the link in the description and pinned comment and code Pancreas for a discount on your Manta Sleep order. You spend a third of your life asleep, so why not head to Manta Sleep to make sure all that time is all the more comfortable. Now then, purge the Xenos and summon the Elector counts. This isn't going to be some high cultural analysis, though if you're familiar with my channel, that's not a surprise for you at all. While starting with the Imperium and Empire would be the obvious choice and the smart one for viewer retention, I have a pathological need to sabotage myself in the algorithm. So instead, let's talk about the jolly green jackasses that populate both Warhammer settings, like a cross between a plague of locusts and drunken football fans. Across every single iteration of Warhammer, you can find the boys wreaking havoc and having a good laugh as they burn cities to the ground. The Greenskins are a strong contender for the factions between the two settings with the most overlap, I'd argue. Fun fact, the reason Orcs are usually seen as green is because of Warhammer Fantasy's Orcs. They got painted green and people just really like that. The similarities are, as I said, basically everywhere. Be they spelled with a C or a K, the Orcs love themselves a good fight and to get into a good fight as often as possible. The biggest Orc around gets to be in charge of a warband, and there's nothing the entire faction loves more than a good old-fashioned wah. They spend the majority of their time fighting amongst themselves, since after all, who knows how to fight better than an orc? There's different subtypes you can find that don't necessarily have an exact one-to-one, but they amount to the same basic thing. The lore of something like Mega Knobs and Black Orcs is quite different, but the general concept of bigger orc what's fightier can be found across the various types of orc. The closest thing to a faction leader for fantasy, meanwhile, Grimgor Ironhide, does contrast Ghazghkull because Ghazghkull is quite smart, but Grimgor is just a rampaging blender. But even then, there are plenty of orc characters in fantasy that are equivalent to Ghazi even if they aren't quite as prominent, such as Azag the Slaughterer or Gorbat Ironclaw, who are actual orc tacticians. Some differences come in the power of belief, however. To some extent it's in both. Red does in fact make things go faster, even for the Warhammer Fantasy Orcs that's mostly just limited to chariots to give them a bit of a boost. Savage Orcs do lean a bit more into it with their paint, providing them resistance to various attacks as well. But beyond that, the belief becoming reality is far more prominent in 40k. The extent of it is something that varies depending on both what you're reading and who you ask, but it is very much more there in 40k. Can you convince an orc a random pipe is actually a machine gun and it'll let him fire off rounds like he's holding an A10 Warthog gun because he believes it? Perhaps not quite that extreme, but the fact some people debate it proves the idea has a lot of merit in 40k. In fantasy, it's not really a thing. You get your paint, and there are different things the paint does based on the orcs believing a color does that thing, but that's mostly it. It's a difference in prominence, but it's worth noting. Their magic is a bit different too. WoW fields do to some extent exist in both settings, but Warhammer Fantasy as a direct fantasy setting means that things are a bit more cut and dry compared to 40k's weird psychic field whatever the hell. The greenskin gods of Gork and Mork empower their lads to go wreak havoc, but in the case of fantasy it's more directly fantasy gods giving their followers strength. In fact, while orcs do draw on the winds of magic in fantasy, which don't exist in 40k, they also get plenty of power from the orc gods, and indeed it can be argued that all orc shamans are technically paladins. Meanwhile, the orc psychic field is something. It sure as hell exists, and maybe it draws from the warp, but maybe it also strains the chaos out, or maybe it's something else entirely. Who knows, but if nothing else, the vibes are sufficiently different that I feel you can make a difference. Difference in the details, at least. The broad strokes of both types of magic amount to blowing people away in front of them with big stompy explosions, or a literal big stompy foot. Looting and dock isn't really a thing in fantasy either. Orcs will happily loot the weapons and armor of whatever they find, but they'll rarely do something like steal an Empire war wagon and cover it in crap. Orcs with a K, meanwhile, regularly do that exact thing to Leman Russes and the like, and every orc loves himself a good shooter even if he prefers a choppa. Error boys in fantasy, as they're called, are considered pretty weird by contrast. Why spend a fight away from the fighting shooting pointy sticks into it after all? Where the biggest contrasts come in is with goblins versus Gretchen, or Grots. Grots in 40k are really not that important, let's be honest here. I understand some orc players might take offense to that, because Grots do a lot of stuff, and in total fairness, they really do. They'll oftentimes be crewing vehicles and carrying around ammo, doing some labor the orcs don't feel like doing on a starship or in a camp. They do a decent amount of things, but to me all of this feels like background stuff. Someone needs to do it, so the Grots exist. By contrast, goblins in fantasy can oftentimes be their own thing. Yes, plenty of them exist in a state of servitude to their bigger orc cousins, but they aren't only doing that. Some warbands are led by goblins, and that includes warbands that have orc members, something unthinkable in 40k past Rogue Trader. I'm sure you can find an example of it in 40k lore in more modern times if you look hard enough, but that is one example compared to it being a regular, if admittedly still uncommon occurrence in fantasy. Goblins being more cunning and intelligent comes into play more often, as among other things, it's goblins who are chiefly in charge of dealing with the Skaven in a given group of greenskins. Night goblins too are something that there's not much of a 40k version of, more elite goblins with their own distinct society. For that matter, characters like Skarsnik are hugely influential in some plotlines beyond being the Grot standing next to a much more important orc like Makari and Gazgul. The dude has one of the highest counts in the Book of Grudges ever and is one of the 3 major players for Carrick 8 Peaks. He's actually important. I don't think he'd be around in 40k, but there he is in fantasy, kicking ass and taking names. The most I've ever read for Gretchens being important is the occasional reference to a Gretchen-controlled world, which sounds like a lot, except I read that in the Rogue Trader core rulebook. You know, Rogue Trader, the first edition of 40k from 40 years ago. Not exactly a modern source, that one. The specifics of how the greenskin types fight and what kind of wacky stuff they get up to are somewhat different, and the goblins are allowed to be an equal half, narratively speaking anyways, to their larger cousins. But overall, an orc is an orc with a C or a K. They may have different opinions on what exactly goes into making the best fight, but they both love a good fight and are happy to beat the snot out of each other to prove whose ways is best. No matter what Warhammer universe you go into, green is still the bestest. Originally I was going to go faction by faction here and compare them on that basis, but as I was getting ready to write about comparisons between the Imperium of Man and the Empire of Man, I realized that doing this would leave the rest of the factions with really awkward mini-segments. There really isn't a true equivalent to Bretonnia in 40k, at least in terms of being a nation-state to compare the main human nation of the Imperium to. So instead we'll look at aspects of the Imperium and then see what the thing GW took from fantasy to make them was, since with one major exception, that's mostly how this works. So for starters, we have a massive nation of men that sits at the center of the narrative, described as the most powerful realm of the setting, but by no means is it uncontested. It was created by a powerful figure who was a cut above mere mortal men, and eventually they came to be worshipped as a god. On all fronts is it being attacked by outside forces, and inside its nobility lies countless chaos cults seeking to undermine it from within. Nevertheless, they've managed to persevere in the dark world they live in, driving back the horrors and keeping a flame, however small and dim, lit just a little bit longer. As a broad comparison like that, the Empire and the Imperium are damn near the same thing. Once you start getting into the thick of it, however, we have vastly different realms even as the broad strokes are mostly the same. The Imperium isn't just ready to kick the bucket, it's been kicking the bucket for about half its existence by this point. Before the Dark Imperium and GW moving the setting forward, it was in a time period known as the Time of Ending, and you don't name something that if you expect the realm to stick around for a good long while afterwards. There's barely a single thing going right for the Imperium, just things keeping it together in spite of all the other things pulling it apart. Even at the most generous, we have people like Gilliman who practically admit themselves they're just putting an endless amount of band-aids on the countless issues they face, not fixing them. By contrast, the Empire's problems are also deep-seated, but many of them aren't nearly as fundamentally self-destructive. Not to the same degree, at any rate. Elector counts wage civil wars nearly as often as planetary governors do amongst themselves, but if only because of the scale of power, a Renaissance-era noble going rogue can only do so much. Sabotaging a small town's grain supply for Tzeentch doesn't hit as hard as setting off a planetary-wide reactor for him, you know? Aside from that helping the Empire, although help is perhaps more accurately defined as not screwing them over as badly, much of the scheming here is period-accurate noble politics. Likewise, much of the issues the Empire faces are issues that actual societies faced, and while those are a bit harder hitting in a fantasy setting, the knowledge of knowing those were real issues does prevent me from saying they're apocalyptic like they can be in 40k. The Holy Roman Empire had problems, but Germany still exists, and the Empire of Man is just the Holy Roman Empire but fantasy. Also on the topic of politics, yes, the Empire of Man has an actual living emperor as a difference. They aren't gods, true, but they do have the advantage of wielding God's Warhammer and being able to walk and talk. Also, Karl Franz absolutely sweeps the fraud perur of fraud kind, not even close. But there's still similarities to be had, because even if they're just the broad strokes, enough of those broad strokes matching up makes it clear they're intended to be there. Both factions are jacks of all trades, with the Imperium and the Empire of Man both having militaries that, intentionally or not, are capable of switching up their tactics for a given situation. Both of them largely consist of normal men and women fighting off against the darkest terrors of the world, and more often than not, winning the battle and keeping the lights on a bit longer. The difference here, aside from yes, pike and shot not exactly being the same thing as a Baneblade, is that the Empire doesn't have the ultimate trump card of the Space Marines to throw at someone. There are no super soldiers in the Empire of Man to save the day, just normal people. There are wizards, and some of them can manifest faith in miracles, like warrior priests of Sigmar, so they can do that too, like the Sororitas, but if that's not enough, then faith, steel, and gunpowder are all they have, no semi-divine super soldiers to save the day. Stormcast Eternals are an AOS thing, for those not too into fantasy. The Empire of Man doesn't have an equivalent. Both societies also abhor the mutant and the witch, although for once the Empire is in part more intolerant than the Imperium. Not the average person. There are some kinds of wizards, for example, such as life wizards, that the average person is almost happy to see since it means the crops are going to grow real good. A general distrust of mages is common, but the average person based on their occupation in the Empire is going to be pleased to see a certain kind of wizard. Soldiers love bright wizards because casting Fire Tornado is a great way to deal with orcs, whereas on average, Imperials tend to be a lot warier of psychers. Both do have schools to deal with and train those supernatural powers, but the Empire's people tend to be a lot chiller with whoever comes out of it, whereas very few people in the Imperium ever get over having a psyker near them. But then, we flip over to witch hunters and the Inquisition. Both are the secret police and watchdogs for corruption and love to scream heresy. They're not at all dissimilar, but there's some key differences. Now, saying things like every witch hunter is an utter fanatic is maybe going a bit too far, but the Inquisition has all sorts of philosophies, radicals, Puritans, some who kill anyone slightly deviating, some who use chaos and Xenos equipment. Some Inquisitors are psychers themselves, like Eisenhorn. Witch hunters, however, well, I can give you the two best case scenarios. We have Matthias Thulman, who is about as morally good a person as anyone in that occupation can be. He takes the utmost care to ensure that his targets deserve it, and if someone is associated with them and even related to a heretic's actions but aren't knowingly taking part, he'll spare them. Ironclad morality for a witch hunter, but he will also still torture people and all that jazz. And Victor Saltzpyre, who's more of a fanatic than anyone else, but will still follow the law in both spirit and letter, to the point that even if he sees you cavorting with Skaven and vampires directly, he'll still ensure you are tried legally before sentencing you to death. Aside from them, witch hunters oftentimes make Inquisitors look downright charitable. Yes, Inquisitors have the Exterminatus button, but witch hunters make up for the admittedly massive kill count difference by getting in there and setting towns alight all by themselves. This is a large part of why I'd say witch hunters are more extreme than Inquisitors. Inquisitors can be fairly removed from their jobs. Blowing up a planet with the press of a button puts some distance between you and the act, but witch hunters are right into the thick of things, meaning they're going to be worn down by things far quicker. Not tired out, but worn down in the sense of they're going to become insane hardliners even quicker than Inquisitors. No small amount of witch hunters will play up the charges against even a sanctioned wizard, whereas Inquisitors tend to be a bit loosey-goosey with the rules as long as it means they can recruit a psyker or someone to their repertoire. If you have to piss one off, piss off an Inquisitor. There's small but potential odds that they might press gang you so you can perform your penance. A witch hunter can do that, but is more likely to burn you at the stake from the beginning. Keen-eared viewers will notice I didn't finish the line from earlier, however, because while both factions abhor the mutant and the witch, the Xeno in 40k is to be purged just as fervently, whereas the Empire is fine friends with non-human races. Trade with the High Elves has brought great wealth to the Empire, and indeed it was Teclis who taught mankind how to properly harness magic. Can you imagine Eldrad trying to do that in the Imperium? Not just him advising Gilman for a bit, but coming to Terra itself and setting up a college? He'd be shot so fast the offer wouldn't be able to leave his mouth for trying it, but the Empire let that exact thing happen. And of course, the Dwarfs. If the Empire was as xenophobic as the Imperium, there wouldn't be an Empire, because pretty much everything on the Empire's tech tree they've unlocked is either a direct result of the Dwarfs gifting or trading it to them, or them using the Dwarfs' gifts to advance further. Even the more savage races like Ogres are allowed in the Empire most of the time, since a 12-foot tall being made out of pure fat and muscle is a hell of a bodyguard. It's not a cosmopolitan paradise. There are things like an ear tax for elves, depending on which part of the Empire you're in. But non-human races tend to be a welcome sight in a good chunk of the Empire of Man, as opposed to being barely, if at all, tolerated as they are in the Imperium. To move away from the Empire, however, Bretonnia. The easy comparison here before anything is the Imperial Knights. Bretonians may have actual, traditional knights, but Imperial Knights are knights, even if they pilot battle mechs. Courts, tournaments, crusades. In terms of equipment, they aren't knights, but in terms of attitude, they're the knightiest. The Bretonians do have a slight leg up from how they can be divinely blessed by their patron goddess and a clear-cut if difficult career path, although I'm sure the ability to just step on anything that bothers them like Imperial Knights can do 99.99% of the time makes up for that. They also mirror each other in that Bretonnia is about as oppressive towards its people as the Imperium is, which is really impressive. Not to justify it, but a lot of the Imperium's treatment of its people comes from neglect. A complete lack of interest for improving the conditions of those in underhives, for example, and also because in some cases they do profit off of those. Necromunda is an Imperial fist recruiting world, remember? But Bretonnia just sees that as morally right. The guy who invented the trebuchet was given 2 pennies and a fat pig as payment, and this was said to be more wealth than he could otherwise expect to see in his lifetime as a commoner. It's a funny thing in a very black humor way, but in day-to-day life the Imperium most closely relates to Bretonnia, at least as far as their standard of livings go. They also relate to Bretonnia in terms of tech, and do hear me out on this. The Imperium is obviously leaps and bounds ahead of Bretonnia. One has FTL travel, the other bans gunpowder weapons on everything but naval ships because of a loophole. But they both have extreme rules against innovating new technology. The reasoning is different. Bretonnia does it to protect its knightly class with the excuse that it's dishonorable and cowardly, whereas the Imperium has a whole load of reasons, ranging from calling robots evil, to the mechanics refusing to share things, to more reasonable reasons, such as being afraid of what happens when you mess with god tech you don't understand. If the unlabeled button has a chance of deleting a solar system, I can't blame anyone for not wanting to touch it, or not wanting anyone else to touch it, or look into the button in case you mess it up and turn on to the delete solar system weapon. But the theme of both of them being technologically regressive is shared. The Imperium does have a bit of that in common with the Empire, and in some ways the Dwarfs as well, but not enough to where I'd say it's more closely related to either of them than Bretonnia. The Dwarfs also hate new things on principle and think the ancestors knew best, true, but this is because they're the logical extreme of dwarf perfectionism. They distrust new things because unless something is proven reliable for 500 years at the minimum, it is inherently still unproven. Not because of fear of misutilizing old tech, or anything like recreating some old horror from the Age of Strife. Meanwhile, for the most part, the Empire doesn't have anything against new things. Known engineers in fact try to create new things all the time, and frequently in coordination with gold wizards. They've just lost the ability to do some things, like make new steam tanks. They've lost things, but they don't let that hold their efforts back. There's not a perfect one-to-one for anyone ultimately, so it's mostly a personal choice that I'd compare them to Bretonnia in this matter more than the others. The Sisters of Battle, I feel, are a much stronger comparison to Bretonnia than that, in fact, not too terribly far removed from Grail Knights. Both are a group of faithful to the point of near madness devotees of their patron god, or goddess for the knights, who receive supernatural powers in exchange for their faith. Both of them punch far above their weight class of being technically normal humans, with Grail Knights being the strongest humans in the setting, much to my anger, and Sisters oftentimes being outright compared to Space Marines with how powerful they are even without the faith. The fleur-de-lis is also a frequent thing that appears in both of their imagery, which isn't too much, but it is a commonality. There is a decent bit in common between these two subfactions. The biggest difference, aside from the bolters, is once again religion, as the Sisters of Battle certainly aren't accepting anyone but Big E. Grail Knights, alongside with the rest of Bretonnia, don't really go out of their way to stamp out worship of other deities. They just believe they're wrong for doing so. Which is funny to me, because another difference is that the Sisters of Battle are right about the Emperor being a god, and the Grail Knights are also right, but unknown of worshipping an elf god, but the tolerance between the two isn't the same. Still, were it not for the fact the Sisters would have called the Grail Knights dirty pagans, ignoring the fact they have similar powers, I've no doubt they'd get along great. And one of the more interesting similarities comes not from older fantasy lore, but post-End Times lore. Grand Cathay, once left in the background for decades, now taking the spotlight. And with that has come some technical retcons in a lot of ways, but Cathay was one of those nations that was undeveloped enough that it skirts the line between retcon and actually expanding the lore, if that makes sense. Either way, the end result is that we have a nation perhaps most like the Imperium, even if you might not have expected it to be Chinese. Stop me if this sounds familiar. A nation led by a figure worshipped as a god by its subjects, even if they're not technically allowed to do that. Several demigod children who tend to not get along acting as their chief generals, and a plan shared with very few that will supposedly save his people from the predations of chaos. That's right, for once in GW's history, they were porting things from 40k into fantasy. That, and the Orcs being mushrooms, I suppose, that was also ported back into fantasy from 40k, but we've moved past the Orcs. Indeed, the Dragon Emperor of Cathay and the Dragon siblings in no small ways are the fantasy equivalents of the Primarchs and the Emperor. Sure, Sigmar is clearly the main equivalent to the Emperor, but Big D is much closer to how Big E actually acts than Sigmar is, given that Sigmar in fantasy wasn't much for grand plans and was much for beating the ever-living snot out of anything that looked at mankind funny. The Dragon Emperor even plays favorites with his children, with Mao Ying being his favorite as Horus was the Emperor's. The populace they rule over is fanatical towards them, and though worshipping either as a god wasn't allowed for most people, they did it anyways, and if not, they view them as still the most beloved leader one could have. It was the same for the Dragon Emperor as it was for the God Emperor. Grand Cathay has turned into what the Imperium, if the Primarchs and Emperor all stuck around, would look like, albeit for a few reasons it's still probably a bit nicer. Demigods do most of the day-to-day work with armies of underlings, while Daddy Dearest works on some unknowable plan to win everything. Of course, GW did manage to hold off on making it a complete one-to-one. For one thing, the Dragon Emperor is married. All those kids are normal kids in terms of how they came about, as opposed to test tube babies with another immortal lady. To be clear, the Moon Empress is still a magical shapeshifter from the moon, because that's just a thing now, but Big D made them with his Big D, as it were. The Dragon siblings have also been at least somewhat treated as actual family members. Both the parents have favorites. They aren't 10 out of 10 mom and pop, but they, to my knowledge, have also never treated Zhao Ming, for example, as someone to be thrown into a hellish war zone and then told to do that time and time again. Hell, the Dragon Emperor even has one of his kids on at least some important part of his plan. Yuan Bo's Warhammer 3 campaign premise is him messing with Lizardmen's stuff as a vital part of the Dragon's plan for victory. Both Emperor's plans ultimately didn't work, since Big E is on life support and we haven't exactly heard much about the dragons in Age of Sigmar, but it seems the fantasy side of things knew the value of actually telling your important generals slash goddamn children what your plans were. Another difference is that only one of the dragon's tops has fallen to chaos as well, with it potentially being one that Archaon himself slew. It's a fairly likely theory, though it is ultimately just that, theory, but in either case, that's 1 out of 9 turning on him and joining chaos as opposed to a full half. More than half if you count the 2 lost Primarchs and just make the category a more general betrayal. The whole thing certainly isn't a one-to-one, but it's like George Lucas says, it's like poetry, it rhymes. To wrap things off, you can also just give a blanket statement for the rest of the human nations of fantasy and cheat. Somewhere out in the Imperium, there's no doubt an equivalent to things like Astalia, Tylea, Nippon, and the like. Warhammer Fantasy cribs off of real-life history, and the Imperium is descended from our actual real world, so surely there's something like that out there. Not exactly the most satisfying answer, even by this video's standards, but I do hope you can forgive me. It's hard to summon up an abundance of interest trying to make comparisons between Koresh and some random Imperial Guard regiment maybe mentioned exactly once in the White Dwarf article somewhere. 40k has been out almost 40 years. If someone was getting into Warhammer in 1987, they could have had a kid who they got into Warhammer, and then that kid could have had their own kid. Give it a few more years and that grandkid will join the cycle of Warhammer themselves. Makes you feel oddly small, doesn't it, putting in a timescale like that? To put it another way, it makes you realize just how short life can be. Yeah, short joke for the Dwarfs was all I was getting at there. Sorry to the quarter or so of my audience that's 35 and up going through that exact kind of existential moment in real life, realizing how long they've been in this hobby. Anyways, yes, yes, the varieties of dwarf have always had their similarities across Warhammer, though it must be said that since Warhammer Fantasy is so old, the dwarfs there can be argued to have played a fairly important role in defining the archetype as we know it. Short-bearded alcoholics with good craftsmanship isn't something original to Warhammer. I have in fact read and seen The Lord of the Rings, but I'm sure it helped at least in some small part. The spaceborne cousins of the Dowie, however, well, they've been rather less influential when it comes to things. Let's start with how things stay the same, shall we? Across all instances of the dwarfs of Warhammer, 40k or fantasy anyways, the dwarfs are industrious little buggers with a knack for making their equipment and tech better than most anyone else, at least in the purely physical sense. The Dowie of fantasy are the proper blacksmiths taming magic itself. The Leagues of Votann are about the only fellows with the reliable access to what's considered archaeotech to the Imperium. They tend to be insular and form in clans, directly called clans for fantasy again, but the Leagues of Votann bear more than a passing resemblance to that structure. They revere their ancestors, the fantasy dwarfs as gods in the oldest cases, and the kin having myths of the first ancestors departing from Terra and the Votann appearing shortly afterwards. And they're always quick to hold a grudge, though in terms of how far that's taken, the award for most bitter assholes has to go to the Dowie. When your king writes down how someone pissed him off in his own blood, that says a lot more about a race than logging down a slight in a computer. I can and do put Bretonnia hate into a computer. I have yet to write down how much I hate them in my own blood. But in both their incarnation as the modern Leagues of Votann and the squats of old, there's significant differences to be found. For the old squats, they were American bikers. I'm not kidding. They were much goofier in those days, like a lot of Warhammer was compared to nowadays. Now everything takes itself too seriously to have American biker dwarfs in space, because we as a species have lost our minds. And while my personal views of the Leagues of Votann are going to color my perceptions here quite a bit, a lot of what they have feels in many ways like the dwarfs, but watered down. They revere the ancestors and outright clone themselves, but they don't seem to worship them. That's the Votann, albeit a good chunk of them would probably deny its worship, strictly speaking. They're expert craftsmen, but a lot of this has come down to them copying what a Votann tells them rather than passing down fundamental knowledge. The Votann have lost some status, but the dwarfs in fantasy are on the way out in a lot of ways, and the kin, as a newer army and thus receiving the early GW handjobs, were routing hive fleets. Although on that specific note, ironically enough, the dwarfs were also not as bad off as the squats of old were, who we were told out of universe that the entirety of their race was devoured by Tyranids. Never actually true canon, that bit of lore, if you can believe it. The Leagues do have some things that make them interesting, to be sure. I do dig the whole Votann semi-worship thing, and their increasingly desperate race to fix them, or at least get more RAM as these millennia-old AI break down. And them being essentially the only faction with consistent robots, Necrons notwithstanding since those were all once living beings, is awesome. But the Leagues feel like GW is both awkwardly filling the role of space dwarfs, which didn't exist for a while, and awkwardly trying to please the people who never shut the hell up about the squats. And yes, those people did exist, little Tommy the Space Marine fan. There was in fact a time when people bought armies for more than just a Primarch's narrative. This whole section has kind of turned into a preview for the con section of Do or Don't Leagues of Votann when I finally get to that, so to avoid being far too negative in a video I don't intend to be the case, I'll end off on this. The Leagues of Votann compared to Fantasy's dwarfs do a lot similar, but watered down. Somehow, the things they do differently compared to the dwarfs also feel watered down. I've always had a suspicion, and it is nothing but a suspicion, for I have insider knowledge on nothing but my own thoughts, and God only knows none of you need those, that someone at GW felt obligated to make this army. Maybe it was because someone at GW who liked the squats was bugging the design team for long enough, or because a market they didn't have cornered in 40k combined with people bothering them made them put it out without another year or so in the oven. And even the squats weren't too loved by GW, otherwise they wouldn't be gone. All here are technically dwarfs, but not all dwarfs are equal. The original squats were dwarfy, but also too goofy even for early 90s 40k, which is a hell of a thing, and the modern squats are the dwarfs, but lesser, more spread out. The Leagues of Votann's Chthonian Berserks are slayers but less interesting, the Grimnir Psykers are like dwarf rune priests but less interesting, and also taking the name of the dwarf god of war for some reason. Like George Lucas says again, it's like poetry, it rhymes. Unlike the Imperium and Cathay, however, the original dwarfs in the Leagues of Votann are a sad rhyme. It's one of those rhymes where nothing quite rhymes, but it's close enough you can see what the person's going for, if that makes sense. This is a sad note, so let's get about 1,000 times more arrogant instead. Can any of you figure out how it's possible to copy and paste something almost perfectly but have the end result be something completely different? Because at least for the High Elves and Craftworld Eldar, that's the vibe I get. Similarities first, I suppose. Once again, stop me if you've heard this one before. A race of beings that once practically ruled the setting has been brought low, but they still retain enough power and influence to reach out across the setting and kick ass as needed. Low birth rates and high casualty rates coupled with a goddess that has a vested interest in eating their souls means they have to pick and choose their fights. Times are only getting harder though, and so they must ride forth into the wider world more often to stave off complete destruction not only for themselves but for all those who aren't trying to destroy everything. Both are heavily isolated and the average human likely will never see one, and when they do come out to interact they're usually arrogant and boss everyone around, or at least try to. That summation is the broad strokes, true, but even the specifics have been copy and pasted a lot. The Elves and Eldar share almost the exact same gods. Isha is the life goddess, Cain of war, Asurian the head of the pantheon. Events may differ a bit between the settings, but they're the exact same people. They even both named themselves after their chief god, with the Craftworlders nowadays technically calling themselves the Asuryani, and the High Elves of course calling themselves the Asur. They're both races of powerful mages, or psychers as it were in 40k, and both of them have inherent connections to the old ones, either as outright creators, or at least beings uplifted and shaped by them. And even when you look at the other elves, there's still similarities. The Dark Elves and the Dark Eldar are both a race of horrific slavers that view all others as beneath them, that at best exist to be fuel for their hedonistic lifestyle. They frequently war with their more upstanding cousins, and they are perhaps one of the worst nightmares you can face being abducted by, because things are going to get very unpleasant in that case. The horror is honestly fairly comparable too, because while the Dark Eldar continue into furniture, the Dark Elves go the more standard approach of sacrificing your soul to evil gods. Both cases are horrific, the Dark Eldar are just a bit more creative is all. The Exodites get in on the game too with the Wood Elves, since both of them are the forest hippie sort of fellas. Both of them also do this in insanely murdery ways, with anyone trespassing on their lands going to suffer death by magical forest monster. True, the Exodites use dinosaurs and the Wood Elves prefer throwing Treebeard's methed out cousin at you, but the end result is a bloody mess either way. Even the Corsairs and the Harlequins have some similarities, with the Harlequins being similar to Wood Elf war dancers and even worshipping a god with the same general shtick of laughter and saving them from Slaanesh. As for the Corsairs, it's not a one-to-one at all, and they're certainly nicer than the Druchii, but Dark Elf Corsairs are, sure enough, pirates that ravage the shipping of other races, just like Eldar Corsairs. Eldar Corsairs are a fair bit nicer though, I'll say. They usually kill you and or take your stuff. Dark Elves take your stuff and then you for good measure. All races between them have to take care to avoid Slaanesh, as her gaze is always firmly on the elves of all Warhammer settings. She's got a favorite meal to be sure, and she won't be denied the main course easily. And to top it all off, all types of Warhammer elves love their pointy helmets. Be they in space or on a single planet, you will find the Coneheads marching to war if the elves come out to fight. But the differences are incredible. For one, the dying race shtick. The elves of fantasy are dying out because of a variety of different reasons. Constant attrition warfare against the horrors of the world, and their births not being able to keep up, a weight essentially on the shoulder of the entire species as things feel beyond saving, at least for the High Elves. The Eldar do share these reasons, but for the Elves, those reasons are standalone. It's just been happening to them, which is unfortunate. With the Eldar, they do indeed suffer from those, but it all stems from one thing: Slaanesh. Slaanesh brought them down from the pinnacle of power to the desperate remains they are nowadays. Every single war with the Imperium or Orcs or what have you that irreparably hurts the species all comes from the fact that with Slaanesh having eaten most of them and locking the rest power behind certain limits, they suffer non-stop. By contrast, there was no single massive event that took out most of the elves. Oh, there's been catastrophes, the War of the Beard, the Sundering forming the Dark Elves, but there was no one moment that suddenly brought them to rock bottom, just thousands of years of endless warfare grinding them down. Remove Slaanesh and the High Elves would still likely be hurting, if less so. Remove Slaanesh and the Eldar still rule the galaxy uncontested. On that matter, Slaanesh is also far less of a problem and their own gods are still around. That latter bit is self-explanatory. They didn't get nommed in fantasy, so they still help to perform miracles and acts of divine intervention. As for Slaanesh, she still likes their souls, but there's plenty of ways the elves of fantasy can stay safe from her, as opposed to 40k where it's either spirit stones or being part of the Inari. High elves have waste stones that perform a similar function, but they can also just wait it out. Other gods have a decent shot at grabbing their souls and spiriting them to an afterlife. Hell, Slaanesh isn't even the only goddess trying to steal their souls. A High Elf one does it too in fantasy, and I think she has a better success rate than Slaanesh. The Eldar are inherently connected to Slaanesh thanks to their ancestors' folly. The elves are just viewed as sorta neat to her. She just likes messing with them. The hatred the Eldar have for Slaanesh hasn't gone anywhere, of course. They just save it for each other in fantasy. The Dark Eldar and Craftworlders certainly don't like each other, and indeed hate isn't a far-off word to describe it, but for the most part they leave each other alone. Incubi might mess with Craftworld Exarchs a lot, and they'll go to war plenty, but by that same token, the two major kinds of Eldar are also content to leave each other be. The Dark Eldar even saved Craftworld Iyanden from destruction once. They did it because they find Iyanden suffering too funny to let be completely snuffed out, but the end result was still saving them. I don't think they even demanded repayment. Now, let's look at the different kinds of elves. If you asked a Dark or High Elf if they'd rather destroy their respective opposite group, or all of the Chaos Gods, you wouldn't even be able to ask the second half of that question. They'd have already pressed the button labeled kill the other kind of elf as hard as they could. They despise each other, with the High Elves seeing the Dark Elves as horrid monsters that abandoned their kin and embraced a traitor and his mother, of whom I would love to tongue punch her fart box, and the Dark Elves see the High Elves as usurpers of the home they will one day rightfully reclaim. There is no love lost between these two groups, nor the faintest idea that they should ever work together. Even in the end times where that did happen, and you ignore all the nonsense GW pushed during it, the literal end of the world and several prophecies being proven wrong or correct in the worst way possible was what finally made them work together. And even then, they were always just a moment away from being back at each other's throats. The Wood Elves, it should be said, don't have too much of a hate boner for either elf group going on, and even accept far more Dark and High Elves into their ranks, so that's a bright spot in elf relations at least. They usually tell envoys of either group to piss off at tree point, but hey, that's better than how things normally are. The power of all groups of elves is also supremely more potent in fantasy. The Eldar can act across the galaxy, and the webway does mean that they can do so more effectively than any elf can, who needs to take a boat to get to you. But the High Elves, unlike quite a portion of the Eldar craft worlds, can still muster armies and massive invasions across the planet. Even the craft worlds that can do that, Votann being the most prominent, it still at least comes to me across more as precision strikes as all other Eldar would do, just on a worldwide scale. It's an army of Spec Ops teams, rather than just a group of Spec Ops soldiers as it is when normal craft worlds go to war. Drukhari incursions are weird because they don't have armies as much as they have entire groups of the most well-armed gangs he's ever seen, but it's much the same thing. They go in, get what they came for, which is usually slaves, and dip. But the Dark and High Elves can wage extended wars and campaigns. Eltharion is the highlight of this to me, because he's done it against not only Dark Elves but Orcs as well, which are factions whose main areas are across the world from each other. The Elves can slowly and methodically march forward as a force, taking and holding land and leaving forces behind to hold key areas. They're a much more potent force, and can afford to do things like burn down the trade capital of the entire world because it pissed them off by sheltering a few pirates. I'm sure they moved him to the Warhammer Indian Ocean for gameplay reasons and to give you a new place to start as the High Elves, but I wish Iceland had a dual start option near Marienburg, just so you too could burn it to cinders and ashes. The Wood Elves are similar to how the Eldar fight, mostly being sudden incursions of incredible violence, but this is because like Craftworlders they rarely leave their home and only go out to deal with the biggest threats to it, or to burn down Bretonnian houses for funsies. This mirrors how the Eldar fight offensively, but unlike the Craftworlders, defensively the Wood Elves in some ways don't mind if you show up in Athel Loren. Kinda. They mind to be sure and you'll die a horrible death, but that's because you're desecrating their sacred home forest. Not because, with few exceptions, they're afraid you'll actually be able to do anything to the time-warping eldritch abomination that is Athel Loren. The Wood Elves are also more narratively important than the Exodites, but that hardly feels worth pointing out. Everyone in Warhammer is more powerful than the Amish space elves that exist to die off to the threat of the book. The most stark difference, however, is how the two groups of elves are treated by the actual company. And yeah, that's kind of cheating a bit since that isn't a strict difference between settings and lore, but it's so obvious to anyone familiar with either that I can't help myself. The Eldar are GW's punching bags in 40k. It's not all doom and gloom, especially after the massive refresh we got not too long ago. I'm happy, and it's only really Karandras who desperately needs an update now, or to come back at all. But for some fun facts you're probably aware of, avatars of Cain die all the time. The Yanari are the most nothing burger plotline at best, and are actively being killed thousands at a time at worst. Craftworlders have to fight tooth and nail to stay alive, which is admittedly one of their themes, but it's so extreme that singular Space Marine chapters can take on the entirety of a craft world. By contrast, the High Elves are in part dying out because it's them saving the world so often. Nothing holds them back when they get rolling, and most of their defeats come at a cost arguably higher to their enemy. It's certainly a higher cost in the KD ratio. The Dark Eldar are somewhat better off, since they seem to be the only Xenos faction consistently regarded as utterly terrifying even by the most diehard Imperium fans. But even still, they don't have the relative military power or narrative interest that the Dark Elves do. Malekith is the star of the show quite often, and can afford to have entire sections of his army doing completely unrelated things while he invades Ulthuan. And the Wood Elves again are a race of elves becoming one with an unknowable forest in comparison to the Exodites dying whenever someone else needs to look vaguely good. To put it another way, the elves got an entire book to themselves in the end times and were critical throughout every single step of it. If GW ever decides to commit corporate suicide and make a 40k end times, the Eldar will be lucky to get a chapter without an Imperial or Chaos Space Marine making them look bad. Perhaps a shorter segment here, though not out of dislike for either faction, I assure you. Early on, the Necrons only vaguely ripped off the ancient Egypt aesthetic of the Tomb Kings, and I can't say in good faith that's GW porting forward fantasy because it's just ripping off ancient Egypt some more. Otherwise, they were Terminators in space. But then their massive retcon came along and the Necrons turned into Tomb Kings in space, with a bit more science fantasy spice, of course. With them, it's a lot of the same thing, but different as far as comparing goes, so I won't really segment anything out here. Both of them were almost to a man turned into undead against their will for an interesting parallel. The Silent King made the agreement for biotransference with the Votann, of which many Necrons such as Orcs and Trazen claim they were dragged unwillingly into. Meanwhile, the Tomb Kings were all living beings until Nagash clapped his hands, cast a spell, and killed everyone in the region before they all stood back up. Arguably, the undead thing even comes about because of one ruling figure making it so, with that comparison as well, and it happened all at once for both of them. The Silent King and Nagash both decided everyone was undead now, and while biotransference took a bit longer than just clapping your hands and everyone is dead, it was still a very quick process. Both are mostly comprised of mindless common undead, with their nobles leading the charge and hoarding all the personalities to themselves. The Tomb Kings do still have their souls, however, because the poor Necrons lost literally everything, whereas the Tomb Kings got to at least keep their spirits. Even their common undead supposedly has some soul left compared to Necron warriors, although any higher brained functions aren't present there either. Both of them worshipped a pantheon of gods with a particular focus on death. The attitudes towards death are completely different, however. The Necrons were all dying early because of super space cancer, ravaging their bodies so intensely that it seems to have shortened their lifespans even after they left their home star system. The Tomb Kings, meanwhile, were obsessed with death because that's the common conception of ancient Egypt, and that's what GW made them, and because the Lich Priest worked on and eventually did discover immortality, and everyone wants to be immortal, although eternal youth did remain beyond them. It was a bit more of a positive things with the Tomb Kings overall, although still morbid. Both Tomb King and Necron are utterly ancient, with the Tomb Kings being one of, if not the first human civilization in Warhammer Fantasy, and the Necrons being from the War in Heaven, the big old conflict 65 million years ago that set the stage for chaos and all that jazz, as well as the Eldar and the Orcs. And they were each waking up from their death rest after a very long time to reclaim their lands from the living and make them feared once again, although obviously 65 million years is a hell of a lot longer than a few thousand. Both of them have monstrous constructs, both of them has resurrection rules on the tabletop. There's no small amount of similarities, even though, yes, I have not forgotten, the Necrons are technically not undead. They're also the most disunited people in either setting by a long shot, with civil wars raging constantly, and with a given leader being anything from insane to coldly stoic to quite a pleasant fella to hang around, actually. Nemesis Xandric, for example, is a Necron that's insane and fun to be around, with unfortunate robo-dementia, meaning he slips in and out of not realizing he's a Necron to realizing it but still pretending he doesn't, to both make it the best of his situation and to mess with people. There was a Tomb King, meanwhile, who had his tomb rummaged through by a thief and a noble, who did kill the thief but saved and even helped the noble along, who was just there to find a cure for his wife. That's a pretty good thing. The Tomb Kings are somewhat more cohesive as a whole, but only barely. The Silent King is the guy in charge of the Necrons, but plenty of people are actively rebelling against him, such as Imhotep the Stormlord, the most notable of those to do so. Meanwhile, the Tomb Kings definitely fight each other, but they all bend the knee to Settra, because rebelling against Settra the Imperishable is the second to last chapter before your story ends. The last chapter is your skull being used as respawning catapult ammunition, because Settra is also a faction leader, but he gets infinitely more shit done than the Silent King. They're also one of the higher up threats to chaos, because undead and fantasy are anathema to chaos on the whole, even without mentioning Nagash, and the Necrons could close the Eye of Terror. Probably the Great Rift too, if they were allowed to build enough pylons. One difference is their gods. The Votann took on the role of their gods in a lot of ways, but the Necrons shattered and imprisoned them to use as car batteries. The Tomb Kings still worship their gods, and did to the end, but Nagash rather ruined the deal with them, and the Hekaran gods don't really talk to the Tomb Kings much anymore. Oh, and the Tomb Kings can still use magic, unlike the Necrons, and that does sometimes result in chaos portals spawned from the undead, until Cetra chucks the guy that caused it into the rift. That shuts it, because, again, Cetra gets shit done. Necron tech is so advanced it might as well be magic, though on that note, there is the difference in that the Necrons are objectively higher tech than anyone else, except for the Eldar, who don't count because their tech is magitech and on an entirely different tech tree. The Tomb Kings were also a splendid civilization, more advanced than others, but a Bronze Age one. The Empire objectively has better tech than the Tomb Kings do, and hell, Bretonnia arguably does too, because they at least have plate mail and whatnot. This segment is shorter, like I said, because especially after the Necron retcon came, they were even more the same. Fair's fair though, I don't begrudge GW for doing this, unlike a lot of retcons. Turning the Necrons into the Space Tomb Kings gave them actual personalities, and I don't know about you, but I don't want to live in a world where 40k exists, but the Infinite and the Divine doesn't. Also, unrelated story, but in a GW store I was in a little while back, some dude I was talking to asked me my favorite Warhammer book. With the weirdest thing to be arrogant about, he said, I bet it was Infinite and the Divine, like that would be a crime if it was my favorite 40k book. Like, yeah man, I really appreciate things that are good. My bad. Then he kinda stumbled when I said my favorite Warhammer book was Gotrek and Felix, so take that as a lesson if someone tries to flex on you by saying they read more Warhammer books than you. By reading the most popular Warhammer fantasy book series, you can instantly make someone bragging about what books they read for fun look stupid. You'll also probably look arrogant yourself for bragging about reading even more obscure books for fun, but if someone opens by being an asshole, that's their problem. This too will be a shorter section, because Chaos as a whole is the same thing between settings. The 4 major Chaos gods are still here, most of the named demons are here in both settings as well, and AOS to top it off. They want the same thing of destroying all that isn't Chaos and corrupting mortals to their whims. In fantasy, the Chaos gods have a bit more depth, and that thing about them also embodying positive stuff rings slightly truer, but they're on the whole still Chaos. They're still the worst. The main difference is mostly for their followers. Chaos cults spring up amongst the common man in each setting, and it's for the same general reasons of wanting more than they have and turning to hell to get it. Classic deals with the devil, if there were 4 devils to choose from. But what we chiefly see in 40k is Chaos Space Marines, those soldiers of the Emperor turned to the side of evil, genetically modified superhumans that tear down the Corpse Emperor's Imperium and his pathetic weakling followers. They say that, and then they get low-diffed by random Space Marines, and Cadians, and Caiaphas Cain, and really anyone around on a given date. Fucking Eldrad beat Abaddon in a 1v1, dude. Eldrad. I glaze him, cause he deserves it, but even 40k authors are letting him beat Chaos Marines. They're scary on the unnamed background planets they burn, and the narrative gives them one big win for every 100 sack taps. Chaos Warriors, meanwhile, are kinda like that, but the baseline is Viking. Normal human being Viking at that, so we have someone at Chaos Marine levels who isn't genetically modified and whatnot. They march up north and either die and have their souls toiled by demons or become a warrior of chaos and wrecker of southerner shit for all time. And what's more, they won Warhammer. The end times means that Fantasy Chaos is canonically exactly one Warhammer setting, which is infinitely more than the 0 everyone else is rocking up with. There are also quite a few different varieties of Chaos-worshipping human groups, the Kurgan and the Hung for example, but I will not sugarcoat it, viewer, they don't really matter that much. They're rarely if ever in prominence, rather they're more of an alternate option if you want to get creative with kit bashing or making your army, as far as I'm concerned anyways. Kind of like the Border Princes, but for a non-Chaos army. It is also worth mentioning here that the Elves are able to outright worship Slaanesh without being obliterated for it, unlike in 40k. Moranthi used to be a Slaanesh cultist, and plenty of high elf pleasure cults exist out there. There was the Lair, and there is the occasional hint like a Inari book where there might be a few Chaos Eldar out there, but it's infinitely more common in fantasy than 40k. There's, for that matter, the Chaos Dwarfs too. Though they waver between being an actual army and not, in fantasy at any rate, they're in AOS now, the Chaos Dwarfs fill the same general role as the Chaos Mechanicus. They're the arms dealers of chaos, bartering in weapons and slaves with the rest of the fellas, with the occasional demon bound in a machine for good measure. The Chaos Dwarfs are probably a lot more efficient than the Dark Mechanicus, but they also only have part of a continent to work with instead of most of a galaxy, so it evens out. 40k and Fantasy Chaos do also have an overarching ruling figure in Abaddon and Archaon respectively, but they're a bit different as positions. The War Master position was in a lot of ways the Chaos Gods just replacing Horus. He was a powerful figure in charge of Chaos's main body of followers at the time, so they had Abaddon replace him, and when it's time to cooperate, he wrangles everyone together and a Black Crusade happens. It feels a lot more opportunistic than in fantasy, like it's simply a really convenient way to bother the God Emperor so they keep the title around. The Everchosen, meanwhile, is a sacred thing that can be tried for by anyone, and there's a whole series of quests they go on to become one. Since Abaddon became the next War Master quickly, and there's only ever been him and Horus, we've never seen much in the way of becoming one as far as it being a position goes. Abaddon was just powerful and charismatic enough after Horus to wrangle people under him. And for once I'm not trying to downplay him and his accomplishments, because being able to do that is an insane feat, but it does mean the position is rather less ceremonious than that of the Everchosen. Everchosens are crowned by the demon prince Be'lakor, assuming he isn't trying to possess them like he did one time, and are largely left to their own devices as long as they in some way do the Dark God's bidding. They're mythical figures as is befitting a fantasy setting, beings blessed by 4 gods who all hate each other to bring ruin to their enemies however they see fit. Overall, though, it's chaos. There are differences, like Kornez Valkia the Bloody as his waifu here, and it isn't an Eldar goddess in the Nurgle jar, but really, even for something like this, I don't find much worth going into. Chaos is chaos. People online who get off on going, well, actually, will tell you otherwise, and since I get off on being an asshole to straw men I'm only half creating, I'm going to tell you that no, it really isn't that deep. Chaos shows up, it's a problem for everyone because the Dark Gods have shown up. If it's in space, they'll corrupt you in space. If it's in a fantasy setting, they'll corrupt you in a fantasy setting. The success rate on average is lower in fantasy because the authorities in fantasy seem to be less idiotic than 40k, and because the amount of things capable of standing up to chaos is much higher. It's also a higher success rate because chaos is also more competent here, and chaos blew up Warhammer Fantasy while we still have an Imperium. Yay. So we have a rather awkward situation coming towards the end here. The Old Ones, for instance, are similar in theory. These ancient, unmatched beings that created countless races that exist in the modern day of the setting before vanishing. In 40k, they died out, while in fantasy, they pissed off, but same general vibes. But the Lizardmen then threw a wrench in things here, because there really isn't any proper equivalent to them. There are no servants of the Old Ones in 40k still hanging around. There was that thing that was supposedly an Old One in the Cabal during the Horus Heresy, or it might have been a Slann, and the Cabal itself maybe was an organization based around the Old Ones that served them, but then Eldred killed them all off screen, so it didn't really amount to anything. The Lizardmen are the direct servants of the Old Ones. They read through the remaining plaques and orders and try to figure out the Great Plan. Such a thing doesn't exist in 40k, until sales drop to such a critically low level that Sigmar bashes into 40k with the Lizardmen behind them. I'm calling it now, folks. If GW stock prices dip below 15 bucks a share, we're gonna get Warhammer 50,000, Age of Sigmar. Back on track though, even the Old Ones themselves are different. I'm fairly certain it's canon to 40k they were reptilian, but in fantasy, by what I've found across editions, there's equal odds that they're either somewhat looking like the Slann, or just gone. The Lizardmen worship them in a lot of ways that make them sound like lizards or frogs, but the Lizardmen are Lizardmen. All of the Lizardmen that had personally had contact with any Old Ones are dead, so everything beyond that is being tainted by what they know, and what they know is lizard stuff. So what are they? Not much discussed, for as much as they are more important than in 40k in a lot of ways. Them being seen as reptilian or amphibious is something that mostly comes from fantasy, but a lot of that is them being seen as such because the Slann exist. It's strange. And hell, on that topic, the Slann were in both settings at one point. And at least in 40k, they were in a similar position as the Old Ones would eventually become, messing with countless different races and inventing and creating new ones before becoming withdrawn. But they were also still around and happy to interact with others, mostly as merchants and sometimes as mercenaries. And for anyone looking for a smoking gun to connect all of this lore is so old it has long since ceased to be relevant. First edition Rogue Trader 40k old. We know so little properly about the Old Ones that comparing them beyond those broad strokes that I keep saying over and over again becomes rather difficult. And either way, there's not really a Lizardman equivalent, these children of the Old Ones that continue their biologically programmed orders into modernity. There's plenty of beings that counteract chaos, and in some ways the closest thing might be the Grey Knights, who are supposedly also incorruptible like the Lizardmen, but there's not currently a single one-to-one for them in 40k. The Tau also don't have an equivalent. The Tau are the highlight faction to contrast the insanity of everyone else, before GW pulled back a bit due to backlash and made them eviler. There's some similarities, but saying the Tau are willing to work with other races so they're just like the Empire of Man is stupid. Plenty of smaller races fill a similar niche between the settings, but nothing worth their own category. Halflings in fantasy are halflings like you'd expect, although they look and act like the person who created them was phenomenally racist against Bilbo Baggins. Ratlings in 40k are that, but with the thievery semi-changed into being great at scrounging up meals in even the worst trenches of the Guard and being great snipers and scouts. Mutants are common, and the Empire tends to instead throw the baby out with the bathwater as opposed to just executing the baby. Ogrins are clearly the fantasy equivalent to ogres, but 40k Ogrin are nowadays mostly cuddly teddy bears that just happen to be able to rip a space marine in half. Ogres, meanwhile, are ravenous mercenaries that can work with others no problem, but are also equally as likely to eat you instead in fantasy. They ain't nice. And as a general endpoint, the undead as a whole are fairly different between settings. Anathema to chaos and life, they pose a threat to all in fantasy. Similar to the Necrons, but in a more inherent way, as opposed to it simply being because ancient robots with unmatched tech are a threat because of what they wield. There are a few things more terrifying than a blood dragon vampire charging you full tilt, even if you're a hardened chaos warrior. They feel a bit scarier than the Necrons do, which is saying something because the Necrons are horrifying. They're magical, but static and unchanging. Of course, this was how I was ending it. You gotta save the best for last, and the Ratmen are the best of the best worst. It is true that in 40k as it stands, there is no Skaven equivalent. Nothing like the Elves and the Imperium having direct equivalents at any rate. There used to be the Hood, and you can see from his little ratty tail and weapon that that's clearly a space Skaven, but nowadays the Hood look like this. Not exactly a Skaven here. But the essence of the Skaven can be found across a few factions in the game. I've made a video on how the Imperium is in many ways the space Skaven, so for a more in-depth look go over there, but in short, we have a faction that views its common citizen as a resource at best and a chew toy at worst. Both factions have one of their greatest strengths as their incredible numbers, overrunning foes not through quality but quantity. In the meanwhile, barely understood and dangerous weapons fire at the enemy with minimal, if any, regard for the friendly forces they might hit. The politics of the nobility are rife with assassinations and power plays hindering them, while the average being lives in the utmost of squalor. This is the Imperium and this is Skavendom, such as it is in the Underhives, such as it is in the Under Empire. The Guard and Skaven tactics are really not all that different either. Throw the big guns behind a big mess of expendable bozos to let them do the work, or alternatively, forget the big guns and just throw 10,000 guardsmen / clan rats at a problem and hope the enemy runs out of ammunition and blunts their blades before you run out of manpower. They're empires that in part run on hate of everyone else that see the land as their rightful claim and will kill everything in their way to ensure that. They even both worship a god who technically is directly in charge of the realm, but in the day-to-day running of things doesn't interfere terribly often, except to bring about some divine wrath. Although for once, Big E is in the moral low ground because usually his wrath is directed at the enemies of the Imperium and not the first few dozen Skaven he sees. But the Skaven also parallel the Tyranids in a few ways. After all, they too have massive hordes of weaker beings supported by heavier weapons. It's just that the heavier weapons in the case of the Tyranids are larger bioforms. From the Skaven, such things can come courtesy of Clan Moulder. Rat ogres, storm fiends, and hellpit abominations are just the most prominent of the many horrific creatures that can be supporting the main Skaven body of clan rats and Skaven slaves. Much like the Tyranids, the Skaven are also a ravenous species, frequently eating everything from rotten food to captured slaves to each other. The Genestealer cults even come into play a little bit, because both of those factions have a nasty habit of hiding underground in a city before rising up in a tide of violence. It certainly ain't a perfect comparison, but Skaven and Genestealer do both have a bit of that sneaky git vibe going for them. The difference, of course, being the Genestealers do it in service to the Tyranids, whereupon the Skaven themselves take on the role of the Tyranids themselves, but with more hatred. The Skaven even have a bit of the AdMech in them as well, with technology above everyone else at the highest echelons, but they also barely understand it, and oftentimes it blows up in their faces. Of course, in the AdMech's case, this is because they're using things they don't understand, since humanity's knowledge base has regressed so much. With the Skaven, they're solid odds the person who invented the damn thing doesn't know how it works, and the people they're selling the weapon to definitely don't know how it works. That extends to their creatures too, since Clan Moulder science is as much art as actual science. Horrific art. Hell, you know what? Throw in the Dark Eldar too, since they like slaves and Clan Moulder likes to fuse slaves with their walls. The Skaven truly are the best because they have a little bit of everyone in them. As long as it was stolen and is made twice as garbage as it was at least, the Skaven have it, and they're glorious for it. And that was a pretty basic compare and contrast between the 40k and Fantasy Warhammer factions. Like I said at the start, wasn't going too deep into much of any one thing. I am but one humble idiot after all. Thank you as always to my wonderful channel members. You are the Warhammer Fantasy to my Warhammer 40k, the foundation I steal from to build upon. If you'd like to support the channel, feel free to subscribe or become a member. Either way, thank you for watching, and take care out there. As an unfortunate note to end the video on, there is no equivalent to the Vampire Coast in 40k, but the Vampire Coast was itself given a massive glow-up on Total Warhammer and was never really prominent in fantasy proper, with Luther Harkon's End Times lore being legitimately a massive portion of their lore. Which is insane that any human being can look at a faction of vampire pirates and go, no, I don't think we will invest into this any further. Clowns run the world, and unfortunately they aren't the Harlequins, because at least then we'd all be tripping balls a lot more often.